Black Lives Matter. Of course they do. We believe that, as does virtually every American. However, the organization Black Lives Matter seems to have taken a somewhat different tack from encouraging people that Black lives do indeed matter. Witness recent Black Lives Matter organization activities in Rochester, New York, where restaurant patrons had their dishes flung from their tables and were ordered to leave. Many people in Rochester, New York now have Black Lives Matter yard signs. Do they have the signs believing that the signs will protect them from attack by Black Lives Matter? Is this a form of protectionism? The Poli-Psych Podcast team has been examining this phenomenon of the Rochester riots. I'm Cindy, INFJ, Enneagram 2, Wing 1, and with me are Don. Hi, Don.
Hi, Cindy. I'm an INTJ and Enneagram 5.
And Ken, who happens to have some knowledge about what has been happening recently with Black Lives Matter riots.
Hi, Cindy. Hi, Don. And INTJ and Enneagram 9. And the reason I'm starting this little show here today that we have is there is some news from Rochester, New York. And I live in the region, and I'm very familiar with some of the topics and the climate here as far as the politics goes. It's a very, very strong blue state. Isn't really up for grabs in the election, but possibly after some of the things that have happened recently. But I want to just quickly sort of run through the chain of events, and the media is being extremely misleading about this one. I'm going to use a time-based analysis and start with March of 2020. Daniel Prude was running around naked in the street. His family had called the police. He was uncontrollable and under the influence, I think, of PCP. I could be wrong there, but I've heard that used as I've heard that mentioned. And the police who responded were having a really difficult time. I've seen the original video that was released much later. We'll get into why that was. And they put a spit bag over his head to protect them from saliva. And I've seen the film, and I don't know if maybe they should have called in the medical squad first. I had the same comment with the Floyd, with Floyd being taken into custody as well, but that didn't happen. So, but the film of the body cam was withheld. We can theorize as to why that was when we see what happens next. So that was sort of put on the shelf. But again, he died in March. He didn't just, and the way the news is presenting is that this just happened. It didn't, and the family also placed the call. He was really uncontrollable. Whenever there's a loss of life, that's a problem either way. So I'm not minimizing that part of it, and I'm not convinced that the authorities handled this very well either. So the next thing that happens consecutively is the mayor, Lovely Warren, was accused of pretty serious breach of campaign finance rules and essentially had a slush fund. And there were businesses that were brought into play here where there were excess contributions being made. Whether or not that involved consideration for contracts or not, that's, they're looking into this. That story came out in late August, and we'll post the cover of that article as well. And I think it was August 26th. A few days later, Lovely Warren released the body cam footage of the arrest, and it is bad. Of course, it's like it's probably just as impactful as the George Floyd video. Again, it's being taken out of context in the context of the entire scenario, but it's still, from a PR standpoint, a pretty big blow. And it's not easy to watch it. And it's, you can explain it from a technical perspective as to how it happened, but there it is. The timing is suspicious, and it diverted all the attention away from the investigation. It led to, I guess we're in our eighth consecutive day of protests, and the first few were riotous. I would characterize them as riotous, meaning uh, you would get flashbangs, and there was an exchange of pepper balls and things like that were going on. There were some injuries, there were some arrests on the first 2 or 3 nights. And lately, I think the BLM franchise, the local people, have been sort of pushing back on the national franchise, and there is some tension there. But nevertheless, today we're going to look at Black Lives Matter, the brand, the corporate brand, and analyze, for people that are our audience consists of people of all political persuasions, hopefully, but we're especially interested in presenting the conceptual information to Trump supporters as they go about their process of talking with people in their own social groups, and trying to just show how there's some very large themes in the background. And this goes way beyond the uh, the actual police violence that may be occurring, and the footage. There's another agenda, and we're going to present that today. And I think, let's start. Don's done a lot of work on the background of Black Lives Matter, and we've all been following this story for a very long time. Um, and take it away, Don.
Thanks, Ken. Yeah, putting everything in context is the big kahuna here. If the media controls the context, they control the narrative. And by context, I mean they frame the issue. So going into the whole scenario with Black Lives Matter and their activity in all these different cities that used to be peaceful protests but are now no longer considered peaceful, even by the Joe Biden camp, the whole context was that the narrative that frames this whole thing is police misconduct, police violence, excessive use of force, that kind of thing. And if you prevent any other views from coming in, any details that would cloud that issue, well, you're actually controlling the narrative. And that's what's been going on, is in situations like the one that Ken just mentioned in Rochester, there are facts that we know now that we should have known in the beginning, but Ken only knows them because he lives there locally and he's been doing a lot of digging about those issues. And it's the same with every single instance. The whole George Floyd thing, those that have paid attention beyond the early days, they understand that this guy is not what we were led to believe he was. He was not some upstanding citizen. Far from it, and was high on some drug at the time, and the officers were trying to figure out how to deal with that. So there are the whole framing of the narrative is a big issue here. I wanted to get that out in the open right away. The other big thing that we want to get out into the open is that it has come out that the donations to BLM go into the Democratic Party, and this is a group that is active primarily in election years. It's really a campaign fundraising scam or scheme, and I know Cindy has a little bit more information about that, but that's kind of my intro to the whole thing. Is that, yeah, it's also come out that these guys are Marxist backed. The founder and co-founder of BLM have come out and said, yeah, we're trained Marxist, and that's what we're doing, is we're bringing about a Marxist revolution. But they feel safe to say that in the alternative media because they know that they are kept safe. This information is not divulged in the mainstream media. They have been read into the narrative that they will not be exposed by the mainstream media. So I know it's hard for people to fathom that a deception could be this big, but by now you know that after almost 4 years of a clean out the swamp Trump administration mindset, that this is not business as usual, especially in the media anymore. So we're trying to peel back the layers and give you guys a view into the things that we see, to try to help from a psychological perspective, help to try to make some cracks into the walls of your friends and relatives that might only see things through the perspective of the mainstream media. It's falling apart, but we want to help it fall apart faster. So, Cindy, why don't you tell us what you've got on the BLM stuff?
Well, it was well known that Black Lives Matter would, when you type that in as a URL, would go to Act Blue, which was a fundraising site for Democrats that was completely non-race specific. It was funding Democrats. So there was that, and I think part of the issue is trying to determine whether Black Lives Matter is truly related to Antifa or not. And I know we don't really want to get into that, but on the screen right now I have a chart that does confirm that relationship. So when you consider that there's the Black Lives Matter and there is Antifa and the funding for both, and I also have an article about George Soros funding Black Lives Matter. We ask ourselves, why would somebody who's a billionaire want to fund these organizations? What do they stand to gain? And I think that the answer that we've all reached is that they're trying to destabilize the United States, and we can maybe get into reasons why a little bit deeper. But just while we're on the topic of Black Lives Matter and Antifa, I want to put on screen a couple of maps that show the locations of both protests and riots. And in the map that I have on screen right now, the protests are shown in blue and the riots are shown in orange. And this is just gives perspective. The news media, the mainstream media, for the most part, refers to peaceful protests or mostly peaceful protests. And that is simply not accurate. And I think they're even being disingenuous when they do that, because it's obvious that stores are being broken into and looted, cars are being burned. And just one brief word about funding and looting is that there have been very valuable possessions in businesses that have been looted, such as jewelry from jewelry stores, automobiles from car lots. There have been entire auto dealers that have been completely cleaned out by looters. So they're, to some extent, they're self-funding in that manner. And one interesting little connection that I want to make is the graph that I have on the screen now that shows the relationship between Black Lives Matter activities and presidential elections. And Black Lives Matter did not begin to function under that name until somewhere around 2015. So that was right before the 2016 presidential election. There's a little spike there around in the summer before the 2016 election. And now, of course, we see a rather large spike in activity where it was practically flatlined between 2016 and now, with the exception of one little blip before the 2018 elections. So it seems clear that this is politically motivated rather than a genuine concern for African Americans to be treated well by the police.
I'll back up a little bit more even and say that um, if I were in the position of being a social controller or a sociologist with political power, and I knew that there was going to be some serious political tug of war going on, I could anticipate that there would be some rioting, and I would go get ahead of the narrative by framing the argument so that the political fallout worked to my benefit. So that's what I believe happened, is that you had people that were prepared to blame the evil right wingers that are, we know they're all into guns and everything, and they're all into violence, and these are scary people, and they might take over our cities. And you know what? Some of them even got into police forces, and they are they're killing the blacks. So if you give people an alternative but false narrative that explains a rise in violence that you anticipate for completely different reasons, you can steer that thing in the direction that you want it to go. And that's the kind of psychology that a lot of times people won't even think that kind of manipulation occurs on that high of a level. But I believe that throughout history it has, in fact. Machiavelli's The Prince is all about this kind of stuff, and it's unfortunately far more common in our modern world than we'd like to believe.
Put it in the category of manufacturing consent. I think the technique was used in Central Europe quite a bit during the Orange Revolution and some of the other Central European um, coups d'états, really, no other word for it. This took place in a lot of the non-aligned countries in Southern Europe and had to do with the ongoing struggle between the two great dictatorial powers of Russia versus Nazi Germany, and then the void that was left in the middle. And this is where George Soros gained a lot of his influence in that void. And what I'm going to do here is just sort of outline what I see as is basically a military attack. And I know that sounds a little grandiose, but let's look at it from that perspective. And you're dealing with strategy. You're gonna have an objective. You're gonna have a strategy, and you're gonna have tactics. You're gonna have all, that's gonna work in a chain. You'll never see anything but the tactical. You can assume a certain strategy, but the one thing that you really don't know is what's the objective. And in fact, we're still kicking around what was the real objective of World War II, what was the real objective of World War One. um, we're left in what I call the conspiracy trap, meaning it's similar to the perjury trap. If you just take the surface face value of what's on television and craft your reality from that, then fine, nobody would argue with it. But if you start to use your imagination, you're immediately trapped into that loop of being called a conspiracy theorist. And I think anytime I hear that word now, I stop and point out that that's an effort to limit the intuitive process of the human mind. And um, I think as influencers, the first tip I would have to people is when you're talking to somebody, if they drop that catchphrase, de-weaponize it, disarm it immediately. It's really an attack on your own uh, ability to use your thought process. It's just as important as free speech, free thought. Um, so how I see the BLM situation, Black Lives Matter, that this, of course, they've hijacked the issue. I don't know if anyone with any kind of moral creed would disagree with that. And today, I'm not going to say. I mean, the typical comeback is all lives matter, but you know what? I don't even look at it that way either. I do see the problem. We have to be realistic that there is some profiling going on. We can explain why in terms of the Great Society and how that destroyed the African American family unit, and look at the causes. I think that would be more constructive. And also, as President Trump has done, to rebuild the educational system. And the problem I think the Democrats have is they need to redefine their own narrative, and for that they needed to have a conflict, and the conflict they chose was race war. And how they did it was by setting up a binary uh, cause, casting African American children as victims to raise a new generation of victimhood, basically a vote farm involving the African American community. And the violence was not unexpected. They've done this in other countries. They've been taking apart countries in Central Europe for decades and know the craft very well. We aren't as familiar with the tactics and strategy, but we're becoming so. And I think a lot of the people that analyze, the analysts, that hopefully ourselves included, see the pattern, and we just want to sort of present that as a possibility, as a template. But what we're dealing with is alt-left urban terrorism, and I do believe, as Cindy alluded to, that the Black Lives Matter movement may not work in overt communication with Antifa, but they are definitely working in concert, and we can see it. I've been watching live streams, and you can hear the conversations going on in the background. Live streams are extremely important, especially the ones that are tailored towards the liberals, the liberal end of the spectrum, because they're usually a lot less cautious about wandering in through the crowd, and you're picking up all sorts of background conversations. And there are hours and hours and hours of evidence of systematic planning when they move into an area, how they line up. And they discussed it in great detail in the Rochester footage that I was looking at. So again, I'm going to just pause for just a second, just get some feedback on that. I'm going to move into some of the more tactical methods that they're using. But any reflections on the bigger picture of objective and strategy?
Well, we don't want to lose sight of the biggest of the big pictures, which is basically this is a protection racket from the Democrat Party, which has been taken captive by the far left. It's no longer your parents' Democrat Party. And this is basically holding America hostage, saying elect Democrats or everything is going to get even worse than it already is. And yeah, it's Trump's fault. So, it's the mafia tactic of having to pay protection money. In this case, the protection money is the electing Democrats. You elect Democrats, you paid us off, and that's okay, and we'll continue to run the show. But you know what? Your business is going to be less profitable because you have to pay us protection money, but it sure won't be broken into by those evil thugs that, wink, wink, we don't know anything about. So that's the big picture as I see it.
I think the destabilization of American culture is very significant, and the protectionism demanding that people kneel and things of that nature. The woman who was shot and killed for saying that all lives matter. This kind of bullying. First of all, if Americans were in a better, stronger place and felt better about their national identity, I don't think this would even be as possible. I think there's been a significant erosion of the American identity and having it be okay to be proud to be an American, that sort of thing. And I think that I see what's happening with the protests/riots as just one side of a vice that Americans are intentionally being squeezed in. Now, it may even be a three-legged stool. Right now I'm calling it a vice because Americans and many people in the world are beset by the protests on one side, and on the other side, the extreme constraints placed upon everyone because of the fear of coronavirus. And this is tremendously destabilizing. And if someone has an agenda to destroy the United States, to take over or put down, vanquish the United States Republic. I could see how this would be a strategy that they might try to use. Now, I hope that they fail. I hope that they have underestimated the character of the people of America. But it's very discouraging to see some of these videos that we've all seen of people, mostly women, who have it's been demanded of them that they kneel and take some kind of vow or other. I would like to see people resist that. But on the other hand, a few people have resisted it, and that one lady was shot in the head. So I'm not really sure what the answer is for how we can resist, how we can behave with integrity. But if we don't somehow manage to have integrity as a people, if we don't somehow manage to hold on to what we have as Americans, I think that it is in peril, and I think there is a concerted effort to destroy what we enjoy in the United States as our freedom.
One of the things that I want to couple with what Cindy just said was that we're in an unusually high degree of tension here because that destabilization is happening, and I believe it's actually being dragged out on purpose to help fuel the awakening. The more people that get destabilized begin to wake up because their life is not normal anymore, and they ask why. And the first thing they look to is the mainstream media. They realize they're not being told the truth, and they look at politicians and they realize they're promising things and have for a long time that they could never deliver. So a lot of this uncomfortableness is actually fuel for this awakening that is gaining steam every day.
So that would mean it's counterproductive to the Democratic Party cause or the liberal cause, which is interesting to me because what that indicates is they may not be thinking this through, and that the people funding this, especially if they're from Europe, which is pretty much a guarantee. And we always kick around George Soros, but Alex Soros, or whomever contributes from a foreign country, um, has sold the Democrats on this Trump derangement syndrome, that they have the answer for that, and it's not. It's actually, that's why I think I can't prove what I'm saying, but my hunch is that the real objective is really, as Cindy and I think you both alluded to, is to destabilize the U.S. And the Democrats are getting suckered into this. And one of the things that I notice, and Cindy brought this up, we talk offline and communicate um, on email and regularly about issues. And Cindy had pointed this out. I forgot to mention this in response, but in Rochester, if someone had a concealed carry permit, they could have challenged that could have happened. But what I will say is that they knew in advance that the population here is so docile, because this is a very strong blue state region, docile population, and you'll find that all the riot cities, the cities with the most violence, Rochester didn't even come close to what happened in Portland. The exception, of course, is Kenosha, but there was some pushback there, though. So this is the thing, that was almost a combat situation, whereas Rochester was a protest. So what I'm saying here is that they're only taking advantages of populations they know they can overpower. So it's a very typical bullying paradigm, and usually the bully sizes up the victim in advance of the attack and looks around and tries to see if there's anybody else that will jump in to defend the victim, and that didn't happen, and this is why we had the restaurant attack. But I come back to, again, getting back to the gangsterism. I just look at it as an extortion racket as well, and the players in again, a school play kind of situation. So you've got my favorite example, I think, is the Goodfellas setup, where the character, I think his name was Tommy, played by Joe Pesci, is kind of a loose cannon, and they may actually have trouble controlling him, and again, that might be happening in the U.S. is where we've lost control of the hoodlums on the street, the people that are just antisocial, irregardless of race. It's catered to that element, and you had the same thing happening in the Nazi era with the brown shirts, and when they let out the prisoners near the end, on the ghetto in Poland. They're doing the same thing here in the U.S. But nevertheless, so you're basically dealing with then the authority figure at the other end of the spectrum, who's the beneficiary, the beneficial influence, who can help the embattled restaurant owner in the Goodfellas scenario. And it's really an archetype. It's a gangsterism archetype, and so then he comes out, and actually what ends up happening is the victim ends up begging for the protection. And that's what happens in the scene from Goodfellas, because the beneficent leader is kind of throws his hands up. Well, what am I supposed to do about it? And waits for the victim to ask for it. And that's kind of, I think, how this was sold to the Democrat Party. But again, whoever suggested that didn't really have the Democrat Party in mind. They, in my estimation, is they were really, what they were going for is just to collapse the U.S. economy. And then we have the coronavirus piece, which we won't cover today, but that seems to be have the same objective, to collapse the economy. And so to me, it looks like it's really just a terrorism attack. The Marxism, I know BLM espouses a Marxist philosophy, and there are some who regard that as just, it elevates the cause to above the reality of the violent extortion from people that are just deranged, out there bullying people that they can overpower and dominate in a violent way. And the other thing with defunding police, I mean, it's just it's a crazy idea that has not been thought through. I think the attacks on women would go through the roof, and I don't mean just politically oriented, but violent sexual attacks, and just this lawlessness will pervade. And they've done this in Europe. They know what happens. They know what happens when they turn loose brown shirts or whatever. They've been living with this for decades. We haven't seen it yet in the US, but here we are. And that's why we have a tougher time recognizing it. And I'd have that second piece of advice for people that are in the Trump support movement is to sort of downplay the Marxism part and just look at it more from just it's a criminal enterprise without any ideology beyond domination, power, and basically psychopathic violence. Clockwork Orange, whatever you want to call, it's an inhuman form of psychotic behavior that just it's been turned loose on the U.S. to basically destroy the U.S. with no other objective in my mind. That's kind of where I'm at with it.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I want to point out that, Ken, your idea that the Democrats are falling into the trap, I agree, but I want to point out why they basically had to do it. They had to jump in, because behind the scenes, Trump is changing a lot of things, appointing all of those judges that were supposed to be left to Hillary to pick, the federal judges. That has been a huge number that he's done. And there, of course, there's even more that there's a backlog of them. But there's a lot of activity that Trump has done behind the scenes to take away from the momentum towards a complete shift in American politics that was the so-called 16-year plan, 8 of Obama and 8 of Clinton, that Trump interrupted. So in order to keep their game plan going, and these guys, I believe, do plan things a long time in advance, and it's not ideological, it's just power-based, and they have all these alignments with other countries and the deep state structure in other countries that have been building towards a global control, a global government, if you will. They've had to scramble in order to not completely lose their plan. So what that's forced them to do is that's forced them to um, put more emphasis on the more militant aspects of the organization, the far left. And now there's even a possibility that some of those, like Ocasio-Cortez, may have been seeded into their position, not that they're willing idiots, but that they're useful idiots that are purposely highlighted to um, exacerbate the craziness of the Democrats. So the Democrat Party, with Trump's election, was really put in a difficult position. They wanted to get rid of him quickly so they could get back to their plan, and he did not engage them quickly, so they were forced to drag out their anti-Trump operations, and that has not worked out well for them, and they're getting very desperate.
I'm going to, in the concluding section, just point out some of the tactics now for people to observe and to give a little bit of context in either we could call it logic or we could call it linguistics. It's really a combination of the two. And the preface to that is we have, in at least in the Jungian conception, Carl Jung, we either have a logical argument, which is more like a math problem with 2 plus 2 is 4. There's very little argument there, but it's usually a binary or very discrete form of logic. Then we have a values argument, which is the opposite of that. Really, it's subject to gray areas. It's more malleable, but it is a rational function. So you can make decisions based upon a values orientation. There's nothing wrong with it. You really, a balanced human being needs both. But what Black Lives Matter does, very, very brilliant strategy, and I think the at least the argumentative part of it is they'll switch from a values oriented strategy. Well, they'll go with a polarity. They first need a polarity, and they'll espouse a very fantastic, like, let's eliminate the police. They'll say eliminate the police, and then the other side of the argument is, well, we'll just reduce their influence, we'll reduce their budget. Values oriented argument. So you can see in the dialectic, they can gradually chip away at the opposite pole. So when that doesn't work, there'll be some new footage and they'll come back and do the riots and the demonstrations and all that. And then again, they'll have their extreme position, and then the other side will again cave into the middle, and there'd be a synthesis. So the way the dialectic works in Marxism is you're gradually eroding the logic of why we exist as a society and things like that. They can just chip away at that using these values oriented arguments that appeal to a very broad mass of the population. But the interesting thing is Black Lives Matter will switch to logic at times. And so for all you budding linguists out there, if you're listening to a protest and they're marching down the street, they'll start to say some you know little catchphrase, but then they'll say, which side are you on? So now they're casting it back as a binary thing. So when they apply it to their own people, they throw a binary absolutist yes or no. And sometimes you'll have people ask you a question and never answer a binary question. People, ever always challenge the context. Always challenge the context of everything. Whether it's somebody using the word conspiracy theory, stop them in their tracks and have them break down the linguistic content, because this is where the problem is originating. It's on the granular level. It's with these really subtle tricks of logic. But the which side are you on thing is just it's a great way to divide a population that normally would reach constructive conclusions, because there are ways of reaching constructive values oriented conclusions. It happens all the time in families, and the process, the human process of compromise. There's nothing wrong with that, but it can be used to manipulate people, especially broad masses. So that's what the Democrats are looking for. They're looking for they need to reestablish their binary, uh, them or us division. They need us divided. I think we come up with that theme frequently, and just in managing a public, as a thought controller or as a controller of populations, you're better off if they're fighting each other rather than teaming up to fight you. So um, this is why this is a professional. Black Lives Matter is a professional psyop. It's got all the fingerprints, all the things that I've studied and that the rest of us in the group have come in contact with and studied, and I'll just point out a couple more in conclusion, is they're using a very sophisticated form of physical advertising. And what I mean by that is linguistically, they've captured an issue, Black Lives Matter. I mean, how can you argue with that? I mean, it is a little bit of a manipulative question, and it's also a valid question. I just leave it as it is. It's a valid statement, but it's not valid when you turn it into a logo. At that point, you turn it into a logo, and then you're going to introduce what we call physical advertising, which would be there's the logo. You're going to see it on T-shirts. You're going to see it on flags. You're going to see it on yard signs, and you're going to see it everywhere. And then it becomes through sleight of hand, cognitive sleight of hand. It becomes you're now advertising a corporate brand because it's not a nonprofit. It doesn't classify as nonprofit. And it's a lot like FARC or some of the other communist organizations, but it's a worldwide brand, and it's astoundingly successful. I can't, I'm not saying that to give them any credit beyond the execution of this tactic is brilliant. That they've convinced upper middle class, and not as many African Americans, surprisingly, but you see a lot of these signs in the suburbs, and they've tricked people into giving them to paying to advertise for them. It just blows my mind, and this is why it's not an accident. None of these things are an accident.
I just had a thought, and tell me if this is way off. But you're talking about linguistics and subliminal things, and it just now occurred to me that if you throw one vowel into BLM so that you can pronounce it, so you can say it, what's the obvious choice that actually makes a sound or a word? Well, to me, it's blam. And what does that echo? That's an explosive sort of a blam. You just had an explosive event. Do you think that might be part of the subliminal there?
Yeah, definitely. I think, as I say, and nobody understands what I'm saying. Everybody rides a horse. Your subconscious mind. I know that sounds a little stereotypical, but it's not. It's a real thing. If you go to a scary movie, it's a movie. It's fake, but your body is going to react like it's real, and you hear a BLM, which is blam. The fricative of that. I mean, if it was a soft, it had less hard consonants, um, but it's got a lot of hard consonants, and it sounds pretty good. I mean, it's got punch. It's got it all. Um, Top of mind awareness. You see the signs everywhere. They're getting not only getting free advertising, they're getting paid by people to display their brand everywhere. And it's an astounding thing. And then you've got corporations behind it giving them millions and millions of dollars. A combination of the protection racket, and also virtue signaling, and also as Cindy alluded to, and I agree, is that they're possibly also subconsciously maybe trying to protect them. It's a self-protection aside from social bonding through the issue. The real heart of what we call virtue signaling is just the fact of submitting in submission to this perceived greater power that could burn their house down, or throw rocks through their window or whatever. Um, This is a terrorist attack, and I think the faster people recognize it it is a very sophisticated attack on the U.S. It has nothing to do with Black Lives Mattering at all. Zero. It has nothing to do with George Floyd. It has nothing to do with Daniel Prude. That these are tactics. There's another strategy and definitely another objective. We don't know what it is yet, but that's not it. But we can see how they're doing it. Brilliantly executed. That's my final thought on it. But let's go around and see what we think here.
Well, one quick add-on to that is that I was pointing out earlier that the importance of how the social controllers get out ahead of what they believe is going to happen, and they frame the narrative. Well, what that means is that a lot of people get caught naively in the narrative trap, and that's where a lot of people out in the suburbs with the BLM signs in their yards are at. they may begin to have some suspicion that they picked the wrong side, but there's the, well, I don't know, I want to be safe and I'm not going to change my mind now. And, I don't want to admit that I was wrong, and I don't want to admit that I was gullible. And the desire to prove that you're not gullible and prove that you were right on that early narrative is a very, very tenuous, difficult to hold position. And I would just recommend to people, if you have friends that are in that situation, to just be as gentle as you can and to give them all the respect that they wanted to have as trying to be a good person on the right side of this thing, but gently try to show them, you know what, there might be something else going on here, and then slowly, hopefully, they'll come around. But if you come on too strong, they're going to just dig in their heels.
I think my final thought is has to do with something that I have on the screen right now, Chapter Conflict Resolution Toolkit for Black Lives Matter. They will definitely need, and probably continually need, this toolkit, because they, in objective thinking, are probably not doing Black lives any real good. And my mind goes back to a month or so ago when there were some videos of African American women who were watching they were there for the Black Lives Matter protest, and when things turned violent, there are a couple different ones of these. The protest turned into a riot, and these black women would shout at the rioters and say, who happened to be white, and say, don't do that. This is not what we're here for. We're here for peaceful protest. And the fact that, we watch these videos, a lot of these participators are clearly white, and they'll wear long sleeves and gloves and hoods and masks to try to cover up the fact that they're white. But it's still, you still can determine it from what does show of their skin that they're white. And these people are interfering in the process of healing race issues in this country. And I think that there are a lot of black people who are aware of that fact. So we thank you for joining us for this episode of Poli-Psych Podcast. We hope that you have enjoyed this episode and possibly learned something. If you have, we ask that you would please click like, please share. Share on Twitter for us. We've lost our Twitter account. It's been suspended and it hasn't been restored in about 2.5 weeks. So we're not optimistic. So we do ask that you will share this video. We ask that you subscribe to us on YouTube, subscribe to us on BitChute. If you have a moment, we invite you to visit our website. And once again, thanks for joining us. Until next time, take care.